I chose education because I normally end up talking about employment, and to me those two are cornerstones. They are absolutely crucial if we're interested in making the country work. Let me immediately say, you just need to look at the title of my book to see that I firmly fall in the utilitarian camp. I make no excuse for that. To me it's really important that we try and make things better. And whereas my instincts are libertarian, they are certainly overlaid by a strong utilitarian streak. I like to think that we promote the argument, firstly, by addressing people's self-interest. I think it's naive to think that your average person will necessarily be engaged in the deeper philosophical nuances of libertarianism, but they will understand that they want a job, and it can make it possible. The same thing applies to education. I do not think we understand, A, the importance of education for the country, and the importance of education for individuals out there. It is absolutely vital. People really understand it. The story I want to start with is Richard Spencer, who wrote in the Telegraph about Gordon Brown. You will remember the former finance minister and later prime minister of Great Britain. The story goes like this. You'll pardon me for reading because it's, to use Colin's expression, beautifully written. I should have warned him or his aides, or maybe the British embassy in Beijing, but I didn't see it coming. And as a result, he, Gordon Brown, when Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave me my most cringe-inducingly embarrassing moment of 7 years living in China. It was 2005, and he was on a tour to show off his foreign policy credentials. Whether that worked or not, I don't know, but it did nothing to improve his reputation for misjudging an audience. The moment came during a visit to a secondary school. When he was their age, teenage interviewers from the student newspaper asked the then would-be Prime Minister, what had he wanted to do when he grew up? What would he like to be if he weren't a minister? Mr. Brown let out one of his deep, forced chortles. A football player, he said. There was a slight gasp from the audience, pupils, teachers, and Communist Party officials alike. If not a football manager, in fact, I wish I were a football manager right now. Her. There was a silence, followed by nervous titters, and I could immediately tell what they were thinking. Football players may in the West be glamorized, but they're hardly to be taken seriously, are they? Why would any proper person like a minister prefer to hack a ball around rather than guide the economic destiny of his people? Was this what the British Empire had come to? While the British Empire is still officially demonized in China, there's a certain respect for his achievements. Then Mr. Brown turned the tables. So what do you want to do when you grow up? He asked his interrogators. They spoke flawless English. A research biologist, said one. A future entrepreneur and engineer were next in line. Of course. The point of the story is one of culture. The Chinese system work for China. The Hong Kong system work in Hong Kong. The Finnish system works in Finland. Now, look at the vast differences between those cultures and those systems. And yet, when the results are in at the end of each year or 4 years, when the PISA tests come out, the Finnish pupils end up near the top, and most of the Oriental countries, including Japan and Taiwan, end up near the top, as well as Hong Kong. And yet they're vastly different. The Chinese mothers hover. If you think helicopter moms in the southern suburbs of Cape Town or in Sandton or something, you have to see the Chinese mothers. They are far, far worse. And everything is done by rote learning, and there's lots of mathematics, and there's homework, extra classes, extramurals, and so it goes. And yet, go to the other side of the globe, and you see the Finnish schools completely relaxed, decentralized, short hours, no homework, play, fun, but excellent, excellent teachers. And McKinsey came, the consulting company, and they tried to figure out what is the golden thread. Surprise, surprise, I suppose. Ha ha. Both systems and all successful systems have excellent, excellent teachers. Now, you would think that's such an obvious point. Question is, yes, of course, you would expect the teachers to have to be excellent. Question is, how? How do you get to that point? Now, if you then move to the other corner of the globe, the southern part of Africa, the picture changes somewhat. South Africa's system is not working for South Africa. I think I can say that without any fear of contradiction. Let me give you one example, two examples. The first is Gavin Davis, Democratic Alliance spokesman for basic education, went to the Umalusi report on the examinations in 2016. And one of the reports that Umalusi and the government made was they had to adjust the marks upwards in some cases, and the reason was that the papers in some cases were adjudged to be too difficult, so they had to adjust the marks upwards. The problem was, as he says, they used the starting point as starting point for this decision to adjust upwards the fact that the results were bad. They didn't use an objective standard to determine that the paper was too difficult and then adjusted the marks upward. They simply decided by historical standards the marks were too low. And what Davis then continues to say is, I did not observe the same methodology being employed when the raw mark was better than the historical mean. There was little interrogation of why the raw mark was better than last year's and whether this could have been the case that the paper was too easy in some cases. In some cases, instead of adjusting the mark downwards, the good raw mark was accepted as a welcome sign that the system was improving. Now, you hardly need a better story than that to demonstrate what is at heart wrong with this picture. What is wrong at heart is the merit principle is absent. When we had lunch, Rex and I exchanged a few stories, and one of the wonderful things he said to me was that there's been, I think, a decision or a proposal, Rex, you can correct us now, in sports teams, national sports teams, that if a black player, in order to fill the quota, comes from a private school, that does not count. And do you see the subtitle there, the subtext there? It is, excellence is, what is the problem here? We don't want excellence. Where there's excellence, we should pull down, not where there is a lack of excellence, pull up. So the merit principle is absent. You all know the story about the Russians who said that they pretend to work and we pretend to pay them. Well, in South Africa, what we do is the learners pretend to learn and the teachers pretend to qualify them. It's a terribly, terribly sad story, and we can laugh at it, but it's true. It's actually literally true. And I don't use the word literally easily. It's literally true that the teachers pretend to teach and the learners pretend to learn. And they both slap each other on the back and go off, and the wide world devours them. So the next example of the denial of this merit principle is the South African Democratic Teachers Union, SATU. In many schools, SATU wields power. They sell principals' posts. In some cases, they govern schools. There was a report in the City Press in December 2015 where they reported that rogue members of SATU had completely captured the Provincial Education Department in KwaZulu-Natal at that stage. Investigators were appointed by the Basic Education Minister at that stage and found that SATU members had infiltrated the Education Department and were running a patronage system. It was effectively a cow that they were milking for their own benefit. It was so, it in some pockets became so bad and has become so bad that there is no effective teaching. There's not actually teaching going on. There's this charade, this game, that the school happens to be the terrain where the redistribution of resources in various forms, including sexual favors, including drinking parties, including all sorts of other things, take place. There's a report, a famous report by Mr. Volmink, 10 investigators, at the government's insistence. And this is what they found. A number of SATU members in the Eastern Cape received cows, sheep and goats as payment for principal positions. An applicant for a position of a principal in Gauteng showed an SMS proving that the SATU officials had tried to extort 25,000 rand in exchange for a job. And the SATU official who had in fact received the 25,000 rand from two senior teachers who applied for principal posts, committed suicide when it emerged that he had in fact failed to secure the positions for them. So it is sad. I'm not going to dwell on this because that's not the point. We have a knack in this country of recounting the badness. And I could regale you the whole time. I don't want to. There's a good news story. There's actually a way out of this. Let me summarize what I think is wrong from a structural point of view. And I'll try not to make this too long and too long-winded. But unfortunately, there's a perfect storm in education. The first one is the apartheid problem that we're all aware of. That history perpetuates itself. People who live in the townships get township teachers who are products of black education in the townships. And so it goes on. That's the first difficulty. So it's really difficult then to escape. Not impossible, as we heard this morning. Thank goodness it is still possible. But it should be possible for everybody. Second one is what I call the bootstraps problem, is the fact that your teachers are produced by the system. Where else do you find your teachers? 9 out of 10 times they are products of this very incapacitated system. So there's a bootstraps problem. How do you lift the system by its own bootstraps? If the custodes, who guards the guards? Who teaches the teachers? That's the problem. The third one is a language problem. Now, the training problem, which is related to the same difficulty, because of the fact that our teachers are not infused with the merit principle, they don't really get proper training. First of all, they don't get it at the tertiary level if they are lucky enough to have that. But most importantly, there's no ongoing training of an effective nature. The reports say that the most important, most prevalent form of training is training where you add it to your CV. It can be completely useless for purposes of the actual qualifications or the actual skill of conveying knowledge or teaching. It's simply a CV addition. Then we have the language problem on the other side there. We all know we have 11 languages, and I'm going to hammer this home 20 times if I have to. We are one of the most diverse countries. In fact, if you look at the list of fractionalization, ethnic fractionalization, there's such a thing. It's a study which was done, and in fact, a number of people have done similar studies, where they calculate the mathematical configurations of fractionalization on certain metrics. It might be ethnic, it may be language, it may be cultural, it may be religious. But let's stick with ethnic for the moment, because that very often goes hand in hand with language and so on. South Africa is in the top 10 of the most diverse countries in the world, including language. Now, imagine you have an education department that wants to teach that diverse group of people, all of whom have different language backgrounds, from a centralized perch up in Pretoria. Somewhere along the line, a red light should start flashing, and I'm going to come back to that. The next problem is the what I call the bureaucracy problem. We all know how the education departments work, and I'll use that plural advisedly. You have the central education department, then you have the provincial education departments, and then you have the governing body at school level, if you're lucky. And then in between you have all sorts of inspectors and regional advisors and goodness knows what else. And the orders come from above. Make no mistake. Your governing body has very little say in the picture. And that brings me to the related problem, which I call the customer service problem. Who's the customer? The customer in education is fundamentally the parent who wants his child to be educated. That parent has almost no say in the education of the child. The governing body, as we have heard in the court cases, can't even decide something like language. And I will demonstrate to you what has happened internationally and how, to use the hackneyed expression, best practice does it. And you will see why it is a case of absolute despair that is what is happening. The discipline problem is related to that because we have all these layers of bureaucracy. I can tell you I'm a labor lawyer. I've appeared for teachers. It is a pleasure to appear for a teacher in a labor law case. Because the teacher is suspended on full pay. The suspension endures for the entire duration of the disciplinary hearing and all the exhaustion of all the various appeals up the line. Full pay, and very often the wheels come off before the process has been exhausted. So it's an absolute pleasure to be a teacher in this country from that perspective. It's really difficult, really, really difficult to fire a teacher. Not to mention the fact that the customer has absolutely no say. If you're unhappy with your local cafe in the corner, the first thing you do is you change cafes. The parents, the customers in our case, have no choice like that. Customer service problem, the leadership problem. You will remember that every year there's a story, at least one story in the newspapers of Mr. So-and-so in Limpopo or in KwaZulu-Natal who has 100% pass rate for his rural school. And you say to yourself, it must be possible to make a difference with good leadership. Who spoke about leadership this morning? Now, there is leadership that makes a difference. A good principle, can make a huge difference even despite all the lack of resources. A school can sit under a tree if you have a good teacher and a good principal. But the system does not produce them. Merit problem I've touched on, and then the centralization problem, which is really related to the bureaucracy. Now, to me, if I may make a pun here, central to my thesis today is centralization. All right? The Economist, for example, reports the following sad state of affairs in the, what we call, I think the correct word now is developing world still, Leon, can we still say developing world? Not third world. Nobody has counted them.
Banana republics.
The banana republics. This is how it goes according to The Economist. Education, and tell me if it sounds familiar to you. Do you recognize anything? Education in most of the developing world is shocking. Half of children in South Asia and a third of those in Africa who complete 4 years of schooling cannot read properly. In India, 60% of 6 to 14-year-olds cannot read at the level of a child who has finished 2 years of schooling. Most governments have promised to provide universal primary education, ring a bell, and to promote secondary education. But even when public schools exist, they often fail. In a survey of rural Indian schools, a quarter of teachers were absent. In Africa, the World Bank found teacher absenteeism rates of 15 to 25%. Pakistan recently discovered that it had over 8,000 non-existent state schools, 17% of the total. Sierra Leone spotted 6,000 ghost teachers, nearly a fifth of the number on the state payroll. Remember the scandal in the Eastern Cape a few years ago, where there were these ghost pensioners? Same thing there. Powerful teachers' unions, says The Economist, are part of the problem. They often see jobs as hereditary sinecures, the state education budget as a revenue stream to be milked, and any attempt to monitor the quality of education as an intrusion. The unions can be fearsome enemies, so governments leave them to run schools in the interest of teachers rather than pupils. That was not a description of South Africa, but it might as well have been. Now, what do we do about this? I just want to, as I warned, drive this point home. Don't worry about the figures. You can check them if you like. It's not really important, but what you should know is that this is a list of the worst school systems, and South Africa is not on the list on this index. So that's the only reason I'm sure why it's not in the 10 worst in the world. Angola, etc., etc. The only one which is not Africa, unfortunately, I think is Guinea. The rest are African. But, pardon? Pakistan, sorry. Kenya is not. All right, now let's look at ethnic diversity. Now, just to put that in perspective, when you have this ethnic fractionalization index, you measure from 0 to 1. The most diverse population is 1. South Africa, as I say, is in the top 10. We 0.88, I think, 0.880, thereabouts. Ethnic diversity, 7, 5, 6, 6, 6, 7. Very, very diverse countries. Each and every one of these has a centralized education system. Why is that? We all know the history. When the colonial, and I'm not one to harp on about colonialism, but let me tell you, the history of colonialism left us with one inheritance which is a terrible disservice, and that is the fact that the French and the English and the Germans, etc., went and cut up Africa into blocks, sometimes with straight lines like that, with no regard whatsoever for the issue of ethnic diversity. They simply lumped people together and then left them proudly with European models of centralized governance. And of course, schools were run along the same lines. So look at language diversity. So you can just see there, 9, 7, 7, 7. Hugely diverse. And South Africa is not different either. Just to give you a sense, and I think it is important because we don't mention this. Somehow we are sensitive to discuss the issue of ethnic differences. But I don't think we should worry about that. It's simply part of the parameters of what we have to manage. I'm not suggesting that we should have apartheid or anything like that in the schools. I'm simply saying you cannot make it work if you have a multi-ethnic society which you try and manage from a centralized perch, and the same applies to education. It must be so. The studies that look at the education failings in South Africa time and again come up with the result that you would, for example, have the same school or the same classroom with a number of languages out of the 11, where the home language is Tswana and Zulu and Siswati, for example, or where people speak Tswana, but it's not the same Tswana that is spoken in Kimberley and in Botswana and in Northwest Province and so on. And they're all in the same. So what happens? There's either a hybrid or there's a more likely a relapse to English. And yet all the authorities now say primary education is best, the foundational phase is best laid in the home language. And it's really difficult. I think the government has heard the penny drop, but again, it's managed from a centralized perch. So that is a serious concern. And to show you why, I can do no better than to take you to the American system. This is trends in American public schooling, and it comes from 1970 to 2010. Now, I'll start by showing the cost, which is the top line, the blue line, right at the top. It's the cost. That's in real terms. From 1970 to now, that's how the costs have gone up per pupil. Up and up and up and up. And every time you hear George Bush comes onto the stage or Bill Clinton comes onto the stage, no child will be left behind, we'll spend more money. The result being that America is now, with one or two exceptions, one of the most expensive education systems in the world. Now the bottom line, literally the bottom line, is what is at the bottom here. Reading scores, math scores, and science scores. See the improvement there? From naught to minus something. That's what happens in the leader of the free world. Now, Rex mentioned to me a statistic before we reconvened that it is estimated, and I think I might put a question mark over this, that this was it Martin, 60% of the American achievement is what is given to our pupils on average in South Africa. You may ask the question whether they even get that. But I said it could be correct because America falls in the middle. If you have a OECD spread, America is somewhere in the middle. That's surprisingly mediocre, literally mediocre in the middle education system. Now, to come back to my point, it is one of the exceptionally centralized systems in the world. It is managed, they have the core syllables, for example, it all comes from Washington. Every time there's a new thing, it comes from Washington. They manage the schools, as I say, from the centralized perch. All right, so far the bad news.
Frans, what's the middle line?
The middle line is enrollment, I think. Employees, sorry. That's right. In other words, you have more and more appointments, but they're not more effective per child. And that is bureaucracy for you. It happens in South Africa. We have a plethora of these intermediate bureaucrats who make no contribution whatsoever to the teaching exercise. Instead, what we should have is a flat structure where you are basically a teaching shop. People are employed to teach. All right, now let's go to some examples where that has in fact happened. The Netherlands, very interesting example where the children are either in classes of 15 or 30 or 45, doesn't matter, because there are no guidelines. They decide, the teachers decide, and the principals decide themselves. They can pick when the school day starts, and they can pick when the school day ends. Teachers across the Netherlands say they don't even have topics that they're required to cover. They can feel free to teach whichever way they want. The idea of a scripted curriculum, pre-prepared lessons that you would have, no doubt, in the US, and if you undoubtedly have in South Africa, is alien. They don't have such a concept. And the principals report that they don't even see the lesson plans of the teachers, although they're supposed to have lesson plans because they must apply their minds. They decide themselves what should go into the lesson plan. Now, what's the bottom line? Does this work or not? In 2008, the OECD brought out a report which found that 94% of decisions in Dutch schools are made at local school level, and only 6% at central government level. According to a 2011 OECD study, the Dutch schools had the second highest level of autonomy in the world in terms of selecting tests and materials for teaching. And just again, to put this in historical, global context, the US, out of 32 countries mentioned, the US is 21 in terms of decentralization. So they are heading towards the most centralized end. The report found that the more control that the country's schools have over these decisions, at school level in other words, the better the country does on international assessments. Indeed, the Netherlands is among the top quarter of countries in reading, maths, science, according to PISA. The country significantly outperforms the US, whose scores fall in the middle. Just so you know, for math, for example, they would be again, rather mediocre. OECD concluded that at the country level, the greater the number of schools that have the responsibility to define and elaborate their own curricula and assessments, the better the performance of the entire school system. So the conclusion does not only rely on the Dutch system. The OECD went and looked at all the various systems and found a direct correlation between the level of decentralization and the outcome. Now, that brings me to the second level of decentralization. I need not tell you libertarians this, but in order to decentralize fully, you will have to take it down to the level of the market. That's the most decentralized decision-making process that we know about, because you only deal with the affected parties, the buyer and the seller, the landlord and the tenant, the employer and the employee. They decide their affairs, they make the rules which apply. That's the most decentralized. So we must look at that. Now let me show you this. I hope you can read what it says. If you can't, I will tell you. It says 3 plus 4, and the teacher says, no, we cannot let the market decide. This is obviously the kid's suggestion. I want to say to you, we can make the market decide. The market may not know what 3 plus 4 is, or shouldn't be, because the kid must work it out on his own. But we certainly should ask the question, can the market not decide? And there's a revolution going on, I can tell you, over the world, where the market is in fact deciding. What you find is, in the third world, the market is revolted against this incompetence and mediocrity of the public centralized school systems, which we have seen. In Nigeria, 26% of primary school children were in private schools in 2010, an increase from 18% in 2004. In India, 19% in 2006, which went up to 29% in 2013. And Liberia and Sierra Leone, around 60% and 50% respectively of secondary school enrollments were private in 2015. So what happens is you have private schools founded by local communities, cheap schools, which, and I will show you now, typically deliver better results. And then you also have private schools run by big groups. You must all have heard of the bridge academies. There's a famous one in Franschhoek and various other places in South Africa, but they're also very strong in Africa. Kenya, Uganda, and then also Nigeria and India. Now, what do these private schools do? What do they achieve? An example, it's of course difficult to compare, because the first difficulty you run into is that the clever people and B, the rich people tend to send their kids to private schools. So there is a bit of an unfair comparison. But there are ways that you can correct for that. And there's a rigorous 4-year study of 6,000 pupils that was done in southern India. And they concluded that private schools performed better in English and in Hindi than public school pupils, and at a similar level in maths and the local language. But here's the clincher. Most significantly, the private schools achieve these results at the third of the cost. So they're better, and it costs a third of the state schools. You all know Anne Bernstein. She's made this her passion, the CDE, and she said, let's do an independent policy research program. And this is how she explains why it works. She says poor parents make great sacrifices to send their children to private schools. This is often as a result of their disillusionment with government schools and their willingness to pay for their children to attend very rudimentary private schools. Studies undertaken of the factors behind this trend and the performance of these schools provide a very clear lesson. In system reform, accountability matters. Accountable to the customer. In private schools in India, for example, the teachers are accountable to the school manager who can fire them for non-performance. Isn't that music? Isn't it? Don't you hear the harmony? And the manager is accountable to the parents who can withdraw their children and their fees from that school. Imagine. This is unlike government schools where the chain of accountability is much weaker. Teachers have a permanent job with salaries and promotions typically unrelated to performance. So there was a wonderful project in Punjab in Pakistan which had the same old problems that we all know about. So they founded a public foundation which provides vouchers to parents to purchase the services of private education providers. And not only are the results better in terms of access and educational outcomes, but the voucher system costs the state 6,000 rupees per child compared to the public schools, which costs 15,000 rupees. We have heard of Kuro in South Africa. They are completely private. They have in fact grappled with all the difficulties, the same difficulties, and they have different levels of schools. They have elite schools, middle schools, and they have budget schools. Now why this is important is if you look at the budget schools, that budget is, my figures are a little out of date, but the principle is the same, is approximately 18,000 rand per child per year for the budget schools. Now these are schools which pass 100% or 95% of matriculants every year, and most of them get university admission. They have an excellent track record. Similar Spark schools, they're very new, but they also achieve fantastic, way above the market results. So that brings the following possibility to mind. Given the Punjab example and so on, you all have heard of school choice. Now, I had to look at this, and the very same Friedman, I think that we heard of before, also had a very strong say in the initiative in the United States. And they did a study, and a meta-study where they compared all the studies that they could find on voucher systems. And school choice undoubtedly affects almost across the board, not only an improvement, but and this is important for us, an improvement in the lives of particularly black students. And the reason is it provides a way of escaping. Suddenly, Sipho, who sits in Khayelitsha, has the choice of at least potentially attending Westerford in the southern suburbs, or even make a contribution with his voucher to bishops in the southern suburbs. The other possibility is charter schools, which are tuition-free and privately run. And the same thing has happened. Unbelievable results. Charter attendance doubles the likelihood that a student sits for an advanced placement exam. Especially large gains in the share of students taking science exams. Imagine that. Attending a charter school quadruples the likelihood of taking an AP calculus exam and increases the fraction of students earning an AP calculus score high enough to qualify for college credit from 2% to 13%. Calculus. So they also boost SAT scores sharply, and a very impressive results, although still on a small scale, because there's so much pushback on a political level. It's unbelievable. It's like a winning ground in a battle to get one area opened up for a charter school, and the next and the next. The Netherlands. Remember, I earlier spoke about Netherlands being an example of a decentralized system, but it goes much further than that, and this to me was quite a surprise. They have a completely unique system that combines the principles of decentralization and non-profit private management. Schools are managed by foundations and churches mostly, and the vast majority of schools are run that way. They're run by private institutions. They get a subsidy from the state per pupil. Now, why is that a good idea? Normally, a libertarian would balk at the idea of a subsidy, but let me tell you from my utilitarian perspective, what that sets in motion is a fantastic competition system, because it's paid for, but your attendance is not guaranteed. Each child is funded, and the child's parents can then decide where to send the kids. And the best schools will come up trumps, and the bad ones, most importantly, will decline and lose out. School boards, mainly representative of parents, as I said, govern schools. Decisions relating to resource allocation, syllabus testing, and hiring and firing of teachers all reside with school management. What is impressive about the Dutch system further is that it's 4.8% of GDP, which is one of the lowest in the developing world. So how interesting is that? It's relatively cheap in terms of the GDP of the country, and that's perfectly acceptable to measure it in that fashion. Compared to the United States, for example, as I say, which is way over the average. In fact, almost at the top. It's relatively easy for a new school to enter the system, and there are very few regulations impeding entry. So you take your chances. You set up your school, you set up your syllabus, you set up your premises, you hang out your shingle, you say, I'm open for business. And if it's a bona fide school, any learner can arrive and pay with his voucher. Makeup of schools reflects the diverse religious heritage. You have Catholic or Protestant schools, but they're Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and secular schools. And this is what the World Bank found. They say that the school choice leads to competition, which can manifest itself in schools firing ineffective teachers, for instance, or through schools using achievement data to evaluate teachers. Now, just to come back to South Africa, you know these concepts are completely alien in South Africa. You can't test teachers for competence. It's really difficult in the South African system. It's the trade unions just block attempts to test teachers for competence and merit. They go on, they say school autonomy can also lead to schools taking a more direct role in establishing teachers' salary increases among other school functions. Of course, what an excellent idea. The good teacher gets paid a little bit more, and the bad teacher gets paid a little bit less. You think it's possible in South Africa? No. An injury to one is an injury to all. And we're all on this treadmill, this wonderful union-based negotiating system, which means that there is no differentiation whatsoever. And then if the teacher is really bad, you try and fire the teacher. Well, you're just the governing body. You don't have a say in the matter. You can't. All right, so let's go to the department. All right, well, we first have to suspend them. And so it goes. That's if you're lucky. Then another variable that they say that might explain superior performance is the attendance at a private school. There's a predominance and a growing significance of private schools in the Netherlands, and the ease of entry of new providers might be a useful measure of the effect of school choice on outcomes. So the wonderful thing is this. Although all the schools are not private, the fact that there is the imminent threat of more private schools and the performance of the private schools, the government schools are forced to perform better. So that is, and that effect has been measured in Sweden in particular, where they have introduced school choice, and not only has the private school attendance gone up as a result of that, massively so, they have found that the government schools, out of sheer necessity, started improving. Of huge importance is the autonomy of schools in respect of teacher merit. Most schools in the Netherlands can fire a teacher, which is not unexpected since most schools are private. But in the Netherlands, almost all schools can fire teachers. Schools, that means at the management level of the school. Achievement data is used to evaluate teachers in most schools, with almost 3/4 saying that that is actually what happens. And also evident is the high degree of school-based management in the Netherlands. More than 80% of schools report that they can set salary increases for teachers. Compare that to the, what I can only call impotence of centralized bureaucracy with its union-controlled environment of teacher quality, if I dare call it that we have in South Africa. The mechanism of choice works in two ways. The first one, main channel, is that it sorts students out. You've all heard of the mismatch principle. You can't put any child in any school. You must match. So if you have school choice, you immediately have, it's like shopping. You go to which supermarket will I support, which computer will I buy. You have a choice, it's going to be a better match. It's a no-brainer. Same thing must apply to schools. And the second thing is, of course, the competition principle. The better the competition, the better the performance. So here's the technical side. Private school size effects in maths, reading and science achievements are 17%, 28% and 18%. That is now the impact of the existence of a choice for private schools. Not the margin by which private schools are better, but the fact, the impact of private schools in the system as a choice pushes reading, maths and science up by 70, 28 and 18%. And the most interesting thing is that the learners who attend private schools in the Netherlands are children of poor parents. Isn't that interesting? Completely reverses the situation that you would expect. And the reason is they are poor, they are disadvantaged, and they realize the importance of education, so they will be the first in line. It's exactly what happened with the school system, the choice system, either charter schools or voucher systems in the US. The inner city black kids were the greatest beneficiaries of the school choice system. As the report puts it, the mothers of private school students are slightly less well educated than the mothers of students in public schools. So therefore, one possibility is that the true private school effect operates via the value it adds for students from relatively less well-off backgrounds. So in case anybody says to you that the suggestion of school choice is elitist, it's absolute rubbish. It is, in fact, the most potent statement that we can make for empowering the poor. So the question that exercised my mind was this. In the Dutch system, you don't have profit. So that worried me because as a free marketeer, I like the idea of profit. I think profit would motivate you as a school to do well, and we certainly have seen that in South Africa. The Kuro, for a long time, Kuro Group was the most successful entrant on the JSE and stayed near the top for a long, long time in terms of growth. Now let's look at Chile. Chile is a country that's made use of the school system, choice system, and they have achieved subsidized private sector funding, subsidized by the state, and the fee-paying private sector is expanded to account for 10% of the total enrollment. That's where the parents actually pay the full fee. Then you have the category of fee-paying, not fee-paying, rather subsidized schools, and then you have a few old state schools. And unfortunately, what Chile demonstrated was, despite the fact that it had spectacular success, they didn't allow the state schools to fail. Because if the state school is not good enough, it should be allowed to drop out of the system. And the resource in terms of vouchers should actually effectively be allocated to the private school. So there's a little bit of a question mark there, because the old bugbear of bureaucratic intervention or politics made it less than perfect. But despite that, there was a study in 2012 which was done at Harvard, where the study focused on 49 countries, and they measured their performance over 15 years. These guys were simply interested in saying, which country showed the fastest improvement? Now, remember I mentioned black learners doing well in America and poor children of poor parents doing well in the Netherlands. The other question that is of crucial importance to us in South Africa is, which systems improve the fastest? And Chile came out second from the top out of 49 countries in the study over 15 years. And another one which came out near the top is one of my favorite places in the world, although I've never been there, and that's Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, private institutions run almost 80%, well, almost 92% of schools, but some, the majority, on a subsidized basis, and a minority are fee-paying schools, private schools as we know them. So in effect, Hong Kong also has a school choice system funded by the state. By the way, I tried really hard to find an example, and this is just to put this question that we debated this morning about libertarian puritanism in context. There isn't a country in the world that has a purely private system. I don't think so. If there is, I'd be glad to learn of it. Hong Kong, that bastion of free market, free enterprise, number one on the Fraser economic freedom of the world list, at least has a school choice system. And the majority of those are funded by a thing called the direct subsidy scheme, which allows schools to get state funding regarded as sufficient to fund education on a per child formula, and to which the school may add by means of funds it raises. By the way, in all of these cases, the Dutch example and also the Hong Kong example, it's permissible for the school to add back. They can collect money from the parents. And I'll come back to that because I think it's an important principle. All right, Hong Kong is in that list that I mentioned earlier, the Harvard example of fast growth. They're fourth in the last 15 years measured in that study. They proved an impressive rate of nearly 4% per year in maths, science, and reading. So no wonder they are literally kicking butt in the commercial stakes, because they just have an excellent market-driven, it's a market mechanism that is making that school system work. And they're also near the top. Incidentally, all the Oriental schools are near the top. Which brings me to the question, well, what is the best one? In terms of PISA, and we can debate that, You'll remember I started out with the story of Gordon Brown and the helicopter mums in China, and the Chinese would be the first to say to you, we realize that what we lack a little bit is how to inculcate a sense of creativity. The psychological profiles that we debated this morning for the conservative and the liberal. The conservatives are sticking to their guns. Chinese school is almost like that. They are rigid disciplinarians. They're fantastic to do rote learning. They stick to the rules. And perhaps we still have an advantage in the so-called West, in the US in particular, because so many of those US kids, despite the fact that they don't get good schooling, in that environment of freedom, where it is okay to try things and fail and try new things and be creative. So there's a balance. I'm not going to say to you, we should copy. I think that's the last thing we want. And I'm coming back to the importance of those distinctions. Why different horses should run different courses. Now, in South Africa, our budget, at the time when I did these calculations, which appear in the book, the budget for a pupil, for a learner, was approximately 18,000 rand to put you through school. Now, bear in mind what must be paid out of that. All of those bureaucrats who supposedly work on this career of this poor little number who has to learn, they all must be paid out of that 18,000 rand on a pro rata basis. What you should have is you should have teaching shops. In other words, the way Kura runs it, they don't have a plethora of bureaucrats. They have a few, one person who's a principal, and they have an administrative person, and then they have, they do have a human resource, because it's an absolute essential requirement, unfortunately, in South Africa, but at a group level, and the rest are teachers. And now they start teaching their own teachers. There's a new group that's called Stadio, which is, amongst other things, it's tertiary, but they also do teachers training. And they manage to find good teachers. They recruit them from the private sector, they recruit them from the state, and so on. So a school choice system in South Africa supported by vouchers of, say, 18,000 rand per learner will address, I think, each and every one of those structural problems that I put up earlier. The question, as always, is how do you persuade? The one model that we heard this morning, which is an encouraging one, is that we should do it at grassroots level and we must talk. Now, I can tell you, when Cisle goes to the township and he discusses this philosophy, one of the things that will come out is the hunger for education. People will want to know how I can give, because I know it's not a secret. The results are, there's definitely a correlation. As a free marketeer, I'm often tempted to say, yes, but just get out of the way and let them do their thing. But one of the things that they should do is education. Because better educated countries, free market countries have better education generally. And better educated countries have better market results. So the question is, how do we get this idea across? And I held my powder dry because I think we can discuss this some more, but just as a concluding remark, I think to go back to this idea of centralization, it's very deeply embedded in the way we think in South Africa. Our constitution was born and bred. It was negotiated at a centralized level. And we thought that we could actually find solutions for this enormously diverse country that we live in at a centralized level. And the rest is, as they say, is history. I know there are some of you who think the boat has sailed on that. But we can do it in education. We can decentralize the system in education, and we can do something else. If we can persuade, and I know Helen Ziller and the DA have a project in the Western Cape, which is essentially a school voucher system for, I think, 1 or 2 schools. Somebody will remind me what that's called. But what we need, and that is my respectful answer to the people who say, how do we persuade? The most superior way of persuading is by experience. If people can see and experience privately provided education in practice, there will be a clamoring. This is what happened in China with their free economic zones. When the people saw how it worked, they said, we want some of that. You don't need a philosophical argument. You just say, I want that system, whatever it is. And I believe if we can have 1 or 2 pockets of excellence in terms of go to Soweto, put up a private school and fund it. Fund it with a voucher system. And maybe have 1 or more schools in the same area, so you have a bit of competition. And you'll see how it works. Literally see, literally experience. That, I think, is the answer. Thank you.
Frans, when you talk about persuading, how do we persuade them? It suggests that there is an understanding of what they're to be persuaded to.
Yes.
What is the object of education in this country? What is the government's object in educating people? The object is to make them ultimately submissive and subservient. It is not to educate people. Otherwise they do these things. Yeah. It is the object of control. So how do you go and tell people who want to control things that you go and talk to them about all these things? I'm sorry to sound pessimistic. You go and talk to them about all these things, and the short answer that they make to you is very nice. Very nice, but I mean, look at your own analysis. Yeah. SAT2 is in place as a patronage system. I think everybody can see that. Do they do anything about it? No, because it doesn't suit them.
Yes.
So, I mean, I'm not being skeptical about what you said. You're absolutely right. And what's the situation in the States?
I'm fully aware.
All the debates about charter schools and so on and so forth, it's all a consistent resistance, pushback on the basis that it's elitist, which is untrue, and on the basis that it takes talented people out of the schools, out of the public school system, and puts them into private schools, which is also not true. But yet the debate goes rolling on. We look at this new minister of, what do they call it? It's not State Secretary for Education, or whatever she's called. She's trying her best to introduce this. It is terribly difficult because the dynamic is controlled. Perhaps you comment on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what I say presupposes an enormous amount of political courage, but I'm trying to create a model which will make it easier. Because remember, the alternative is a terrifying notion, is that we say we are going to reform the system, and the first thing that we will be told is it's a change of law of social impact, so it must be negotiated at NEDLAC. Can you imagine that? A national wholesale reform to something like this. So what I'm saying is, let's create 1 or 2 examples, and hopefully you will have so much groundswell support that it becomes awkward.
If I can just follow up, I'm sorry to do it. If you want to deconstruct the control, you have to deconstruct it at a whole range of levels. Not only the ones you talk about with respect, but you've also got to abolish compulsory schooling, because the consequence of compulsory schooling is compulsory vetting of curricula. The consequence of compulsory vetting of curricula is gatekeeping on schools. The consequence of gatekeeping on schools is the limitation of the number of private schools. The limitation on that is productive of the very control that we're concerned about. And those things require immense courage. They've started to do it in India.
There's a massive political
obstacle.
Anyway, I don't know.
I just think that the best you can do is to say, well, which way are you going to be able to have
the least resistance and the greatest impact. And I have thought about all kinds of examples. The other question that we can might as well throw out the window now is that we'll sit around a political table and rationalize this on a rational basis, discuss this, debate this, and some politician will say, you know what? Or the nation will, the voting public out there will suddenly get an insight from all this talking. That's what I'm trying to avoid. I'm saying that is stillborn as far as I'm concerned. I hear what you're saying. It's stillborn, but it's less so. I think we should make the best. Where's the thin end of the wedge? And I know that unions will probably also say this is the thin end of the wedge, but I really think it will be. It will be because it will demonstrate. The worst thing that can happen, of course, is that it will work. That will really upset the trade unions.
I'm interested in a lot of these things, and I've got a few comments here, somewhat randomly scattered. South Africa's got some of the best schools in the world, government schools.
Yes.
And I went to one in Durban that I'm very proud of. I actually went back to the school last year, and in my day, if any adult walked past you as a student, you stood up to attention and said, good afternoon, sir, and so on. And last year, on 2 occasions, I went back to my old school that I hadn't been to for decades. One afternoon, I walked in just dressed like this in the middle of the afternoon. I wondered what the school would be like now, because where I live now, Pretoria, it's not like that. And I walked through the school grounds during sports, and every single kid I walked by stood to attention and said, good afternoon, sir. Nobody knew who I was. That was exactly how it was when I was there. It's run unbelievably well now, and the school is about 50% black, if not more than 50% black, and the black kids are exactly like that as well. There was actually a video clip that somebody sent me on the WhatsApp the other day. The black guy sent me and he said, look how proudly we can organise South African schools, and lo and behold, it was my school going to play a rugby game. And so I was quite bucked about that. I think one of so we would allow diversity of different types of schools. And when you see the newspapers talk about the schooling system, they're talking about a median at the bottom, not even a median. As far as I'm concerned, one of the main problems is we've got too many kids in school. Now, these are things you don't go and say in public, so to speak. Because they've tried to show education by pumping children into school, and then when they pump children into school, they want to see the matric results. So they've got these figures about how many kids go into school in grade 1 and how many matriculate, which if you look around the world, the figures are also about 50% or something. They're not big numbers. So what we need to do is to have a look and say, not all kids must go to school in the conventional way. I mean, for example, they need to have honourable exits at age 13, 14 or something to go out and do some trade craft. And it's much better leaving school, I think, at about age 13 or something and going out and becoming a highly competent bricklayer or something than battling all the way to try and get your matric in biblical studies and history. I've got a friend who's got a farm in Polokwane. He employs 140 people on the farm. It's a very big operation. And he tells me that every week he's got some black fellow coming in there with a tie on saying, can I work in your office? Because I've got matric and something like biblical studies and history. And he says, no, he's got a couple of people in the office. He doesn't want more. Because what he really wants is a diesel mechanic. He says, you can't find a diesel mechanic for love or money. He said, he'll pay a diesel mechanic triple what he'll pay any guy with a matric to sit in the office. And you just can't find them. But at the moment, there's child labour laws that say you can't employ people under the age of 16 or whatever. Now, that's so that you don't use them as horses like in the coal mines that happened in the UK and in centuries gone by. But we need to change the labour laws and say somebody can honourably leave school at 12 or something like that and go and become a recognised apprentice that leads to a money making. The gentleman over there said, what is education for? The political compliance, which is probably correct now. What it should be for is to enable you to earn money. It doesn't mean you ought to know who Shakespeare is. It means you ought to be able to come out there and earn a living for yourself, either as a welder or something like that. So another thing that is significant is by the way, I also last year was invited by the headmaster to go back to my old school for the annual big rugby match that they have between two particular schools. And I arrived there on the day and it's a very grand occasion. And at one stage I saw a number of Dutch people standing talking. There were 6 pairs of Dutch parents. And I said, what are you doing here? And I said, no, our kids are in the school. I said, why? And I said, in Holland it's considered really terrific if you can get your child into a South African school. So the Dutch kids, I said, they're queuing up. It's almost impossible because here it's tax subsidised or whatever. And their kid was in matric and they'd come to watch the matric rugby because he was in the rugby team. And they said, oh, the Dutch schools are disorganised. I'm not disagreeing with your principal. He said, it's far better here. They've got uniforms and they obey and they do things properly and the education is far better. So anyway, the other little bit I want to add, the early childhood development is terribly important. And that's been a thing for a while. For a few years, I've been involved with running a chess program in basically black schools around the country. We started in 2010 with zero money, 0 kids, 0 everything. We've now got 50,000 children in our classes every week, and we run it as a completely private operation. It's called Moves for Life. You can look it up. And what happens with the chess is that you teach the kids to analyze the situation, make a decision, execute the decision, and live with the consequences of your decision. And you'll be amazed how that changes the attitude to math, science, English, everything improves. They walk straighter, they speak better, everything, it's amazing. We've got 2 universities studying the results now, and it's dramatic, the difference. And there you find at home, the home environment has never taught the children to listen and to make a decision and act on the decision. They just sit there in a channel because the parents are labourers or something like that. As soon as we get hold of them through our system, it completely changes the outlook. I agree with you saying if you're a poor kid and you get into a better school, you catapult forward. And then finally, you mentioned about the poor management. That I think is critical. We find when you go to the top schools in South Africa, there's a case of pride in working there. It's well managed, there's discipline amongst the staff. You go to some of these rural schools, come school finishing time, like about lunchtime, the kids are crushed in the rush and the teachers go home before the kids do. You try and organise a soccer game after school in some of those schools, not a chance, the teachers are gone. To get volunteer teachers to stay and organise soccer or after school sport or any after school activity, not a chance. So I think one of the first things they should do is say all school teachers work 8 to 4:30 and they have 2 weeks or 3 weeks leave and that's it. Other than that, you'll be at school. And if you're not teaching at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you're running soccer.
That sounds like a central management.
Yeah, that's where it starts.
I just want to, I'm not going to answer all of those. Because there's lots of things. I just want to come back to one point, and that is the best, I believe, the best apprenticeship system in the world is the Swiss one. And it's an honor there it's really honorable exit. At least half the learners go into, but it's a whole variety of things like banking and IT and computer management and then the traditional skills like welding and electricity and so on. So it's a wonderful system. They still stay in school, but they actually start learning. So by the time they get to 19, they actually have work experience. They're useful, they can be employed. So that I think is a wonderful system.
Okay, some other speakers. I go over here. Andrew.
I enjoyed your speech very much. I agree with you entirely. Just to say, I think the most important question in education, or maybe in the whole of politics, is this. What school do you choose to send your own children to? So if you look at, for example, the Minister of Education, a Lady Pendle, big intellectual, socialist state schooling. Tell me, Mrs. Minister, what school do you send your children to? Her son goes to Bishop's and her daughter went to Herschel. You say, but excuse me, I thought you believed in state schooling. Well, how do you explain this? And then what do you want to say to? I tell you what the people of South Africa want. They want to send their children to the same school as you choose to send your children to. Why don't you make that happen? And it's the same around the world. I taught in England at a comprehensive school. The socialist government wrecked schooling for working class children, entered grammar schools, forced them into these ghastly comprehensive schools, which they've never recovered from. And Shirley Williams, big socialist saint, she's behind it. And some interviewer said, your own daughter, where do you send her to? One of these, well, actually no, because little, the Gwendoline or whatever, very sensitive girls, they actually sent her to private school. The Sub-2 teachers don't send their own children to schools with Sub-2 teachers. They send them to Model C in private. Not one single parliamentarian, not one single one. send their children to a township school, say, to cheat. Not one of them.
Well, that's the litmus test for health as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think this point must be driven home to those liars and hypocrites who are telling us about this. It must be compulsory that they tell you where they send their own children to before they pronounce an educational theory.
Why don't we call for an audit?
I just want to say that unlike libertarianism, socialism is not a lifestyle choice.
Yes, I have two short questions. So I think last year they passed the Basic Education Amendment Act, which made school, which basically emasculated school governing bodies. The FMF, I did a few interviews for the FMF about it, and the thing that the journalists kept saying that the government said was that in poor areas, the people composing the school governing bodies are too illiterate to really make decisions for their children, basically saying, how can you know what a good education looks like when you yourself are too stupid or whatever. No, that's what the government is saying. Of course, the free market response is that people instinctively always know what's better for themselves and so forth, and that was my argument. I'd just like to have your thoughts on that. And then the second question is, in South Africa, I think we have a very radical right to private education. So I don't see this in many other constitutions. We have a right in South Africa to private education. But I don't see people making use of that. It's quite bizarre to me that, I mean, look at AfriForum. They still take language cases to court at public schools. They obviously are going to lose all those cases, and I think they know that. But why still bother with public schools when we have this extremely strong right to private education? I would think that all independently minded people in South Africa, surely AfriForum's members, for example, would put all their kids in AfriForum schools or whatever you want to say. But that doesn't happen. We have good private education, but like I would imagine it would have been 10 times the current size it would be, given that we have an actual right to private education in South Africa. So yeah, just your thoughts on this.
I agree that we have far too low private education. Can I understand, do you interpret the right as being one which entitles you to enforce it as against the government? For example, like we've got people who enforce the right to housing.
Well, the Constitution says that all South Africans have a right to an independent education, and the only requirement is that it shouldn't be racist, it must be registered, and it should be of equal and not inferior quality, or it should be equal or superior quality than state education, which goes without saying. So it's an extremely strong right. I mean, you don't have to put your kid as a township dweller in the local state school. The community can come together and establish a community private school.
But yes,
that option is there. But
is the obstacle lack of legal redress, or is it simply?
No, my question is, why is it not happening? People seem to not know that this exists. I don't know if you have some insights into that.
I'm inclined to think that the reason is not the lack of legal means. It's not the legal remedy which is lacking, it's the material means and the interest, the knowledge. I think it must be far more graphically illustrated. But it's already happening to some extent. There are low budget schools in the townships. It's just not, I agree, it's not happening as fast as one would like to see it. But just to come back to the first question, it seems to me that it's like saying to somebody, you have to understand the intricate workings of a motor car in order to buy one. You appoint experts to run the school. You've got teachers, you've got a principal. These guys are trained. All that the parent is interested in is this a good school or not? And that they can see. Trust me, they can see if the school is performing. So you don't need to be an expert. It's a silly one.
Two comments and a question. I can't think of a better speech to introduce this concept that I came across recently, which is that the number of productive people in any organization is equal to the square root of the number of people employed. And this apparently is I was searching for the name of the law. It's something like Duncan's law or something like that. But this is well established. Price's law. Price's law, you're quite right, yeah. That would seem to me to be relevant to the organisation of schools and just about everything else. In an organisation of 64 people, only 8 people are actually productive. Second quick comment is my all-time favourite movie at this stage just about is Captain Fantastic. I don't know if you've seen it. And it's essentially a story about another way of raising your kids.
Yeah.
Very, very alternative.
Homeschooling.
Yeah, brilliant movie.
Okay,
Highly
the
recommend.
question.
Yeah, the question that I'm coming to now is that you essentially said that you're basically a utilitarian in your judgment of these things, which means that essentially you will apply your judgment as to what is the most utility in these, or in the education situation, for example. You may say that Hong Kong system is better or the Dutch system is better. How else would you do a utilitarian judgment without imposing your judgment on the decision?
I'm relying, if I say utilitarian, what I'm saying is that the market must choose. I don't say that you should have this kind of education or that. For example, let me give you a good example. Shanghai has a system where you have a senior teacher who monitors the teaching of a junior teacher. It's a wonderful system. They come in on a regular basis and then they critique the teacher. And it's a top teacher who does the monitoring. It's almost on-the-job training. Instead of sending them off to courses like we tend to do and then they get pieces of paper, there's a very experienced teacher that actually takes you step by step and monitors, and the results are there for all to see. Now, I would be very tempted to say, let's have that system, but that's not what I'm proposing. What I'm proposing is let the private entrepreneurs see what the market wants. They must sort it out amongst themselves. All I'm saying is create the room so that they can in fact take that decision.
I don't agree with that, but I would have said it's not utilitarian, it's free market.
Yeah, well, when I'm saying it's utilitarian, only means that I think we're ultimately going to have better results. Yeah.
We're going to let a new speaker ask a question, and one over there, and then we're going to break for
Then
tea.
we'll stop.
Early in your book, you deal a bit with sport. You talk of rugby and cricket. You don't talk of football. You think at atrocious level, our football team, our national football team, has anything to do with the education system?
That's an interesting one. I have absolutely no idea.
I'll make a comment.
Yeah, but I
asked
think-
this question before, and someone said in SATA arranged at Codesa that black teachers don't do extramural duties. So there's no sport you calculate into kids at school.
That's very interesting, but it may also simply have to do with the fact that, you know, that we have very good sports schools, and the black players that are players in the national teams in rugby and cricket come from either Model C schools or private schools. So there's something to be said for the fact that you should have a good schooling system if you're interested in good sport. But further than that, I can't take it further.
It's the extramural duties where the
Yeah, but I just balked at the suggestion that we must make a new rule. That's the knee-jerk reaction is to say the state will impose a rule that says you must work from 8 to 4. The corpses are many and varied that lie in the wake of that kind of rule-making. I think we should have the school decide what's going to work for the school.
I agree with you, but it's not happening at the moment. So the teachers go home at lunch.
Okay, Claire?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting, maybe a nice point to close on, in that my son's school runs on a slightly unusual model. He's 8, he goes to a school, whereas 50, it's a small private school in Neisner, 50% of the children that go there are sponsored by other community members from the township. Yeah? And what happens is those parents are then elected into the governing body. And what has happened now is the school has actually grown dramatically over the last 5 years, from class sizes of 10 now to class sizes of 15 to 20. They won't exceed 20 children per class as a school policy. But that's really good in that the community actually gets involved. In the school, the extramurals consist of cookery, basic engineering, and very knowledgeable subjects that way to actually give pupils skills. And it's an interesting model.
The customer is the parent. You know?
Yes.
Nobody knows better.
Okay, Colin's pleading with me here.
If the libertarian position, as we just heard expressed, is that nobody knows better their own interest than the human being involved, why should your views trump the views of millions of South Africans who are clearly comfortable with the current situation? Expressed through the ballot box endlessly and again and again.
I think you're making assumptions about education. I don't believe that the message is getting across. I simply think that's what's happening. I don't think the message is getting across. That's where I came in, is how do we persuade? I don't believe, I think it's going to be really difficult. No disrespect to the talk that we had first this morning, but it's really difficult to sit around the table and actually explain to people what is good for them and then have a rational conclusion. Far more potent to say experience is the best teacher.
Okay, Frans, thank you very much.